It's true. Across the globe, women aren't as prosperous as men. Gender inequality is a pressing moral issue, but we forget it has massive economic implications. If you were to put all of the women who don't have access to formal financial services in one place, they would make up the third largest country in the world. That means an entire population without bank accounts, credit cards, or other tools you and I likely benefit from daily. Prosperity for women starts with inclusive policies, products, and people around the globe, and the investment to make it happen. Welcome to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast. My name is Sonia Kelly, and I lead Women's World Banking's proprietary research division. Join me as I speak with changemakers around the globe to deconstruct the social and economic exclusion women face. We'll discover new evidence together and drive action to accelerate women's economic empowerment. Because a leg up isn't a handout, it's a global game changer. Indeed. Welcome and thanks so much for tuning into the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, now streaming on YouTube and available wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on YouTube, you'll be able to find additional insights and resources linked in the description of the video. I'm the host of the show, Sonia Kelly, and I'm also the global head of the Women's World Banking Institute. Now, before we get started, I'd like to give a special shout out to the sponsor of the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, Ernst & Young LLP. EY is a global leader working across assurance, consulting, law, strategy, tax, and transactions. EY teams ask better questions to find new answers for the complex issues facing our world today. You can visit their website at ey.com to explore their latest insights and services. Now let's jump into the show. Today we're going to be talking about AI, and specifically the question of whether protections are keeping pace with risks. Now, when designed responsibly, AI can incorporate alternative data, can expand access for women with thin credit histories, can improve product suitability, can strengthen fraud detection, and can lower operating costs so institutions can sustainably serve smaller customers. And we're already seeing this opportunity turn into reality in markets like India and Indonesia, where digital systems designed with women in mind increase activation of accounts, deepen usage of savings products, and build confidence in using all kinds of financial instruments. My colleagues around the world know this firsthand, but we're also seeing very real risks, even extending beyond financial exclusion. AI is already being weaponized against women through gender-based violence online. The rapid spread of AI-generated deepfakes and non-consensual intimate images has targeted millions of women and girls, often with devastating consequences, from harassment and blackmail to women leaving school, jobs, or public life entirely. You can see how this would have an impact on the 25% of women in emerging markets who are entrepreneurs. Now, when technology is deployed without safeguards, it can reinforce the very inequalities we are trying to dismantle. This pattern also appears inside financial systems. AI models that are trained on incomplete or biased data can reinforce existing exclusions. Women who were never given the chance to build formal credit histories can be labeled higher risk, even though they might actually be a better risk for financial services providers. AI-enabled fraud is also rising, often hitting low-income women the hardest. And when foundational infrastructure like digital ID systems or interoperable payments or gender disaggregated data frameworks, when these systems are not designed with women in mind, exclusion begins at the very base layer. Now, trust is therefore foundational and fundamental. But trust is not something women owe financial institutions. These institutions and systems must earn it. That requires human-centered design, strong consumer protection, investment in women's digital and financial capability, alongside of those really important human touch points that help women use new tools with confidence. We know firsthand that when institutions design intentionally for women, the commercial case strengthens, markets expand, risk perceptions shift, institutions build stronger, more loyal customer portfolios, and social impact and business performance reinforce one another. And we know that AI can strengthen that alignment, but only if bias testing, transparency, and responsible data governance are built in from the start. Now, let's talk to our guest. Henry Ajder is a leading expert on AI, deepfakes, and the fast evolving synthetic media landscape. Welcome, Henry.
Thanks so much, Sonia. Great to be with you today.
Now, Henry, I'm very aware that when you were younger and thinking about what you wanted to do with your life, AI was like not a career you would go into. Can you tell me how you got into this space?
You know, it's funny, Sonia, as part of doing this work, I ended up getting some coverage of some of my research in Rolling Stone. And when I was a teenager, I think my hope would have been that being in Rolling Stone would have been because I was getting profiled in a really cool band or something, not necessarily because my research on intimate image abuse against women was kind of changing the kind of landscape of how we think about AI harm. So certainly a career that I don't think I saw coming, but one that I'm really glad to be doing now, given how important this space is to understand better. My work really in this space emerged off the back of my academic studies in philosophy. I was interested in understanding how technology was kind of changing paradigms and ways of thinking about the world and thinking about media and the way that we interact with each other and how we think about truth as well and things like this. And so when deepfakes as an issue first emerged in late 2017, it really kind of brought together those two interests of kind of philosophy and technology in terms of how we think about what is sufficient evidence to make a claim about truth, right? How is this going to change the way that we see ourselves? And so off the back of that, I decided I wanted to go look into this space more, this kind of new, emerging, and often quite murky world. And so I did a lot of, I guess, first of its kind research mapping the landscape. I refer to my work now as doing kind of cartography, mapping this fast evolving space. It often feels like doing cartography in a sandstorm, right? Moving very, very quickly, the landscape shifting. But having done that across various different organizations, from startups to academic institutions to now being an independent advisor to government and businesses around the world, my job is now fundamentally to try and help people get a grasp on where they are within this fast moving landscape, to then understand how they can respond, both in terms of to the opportunities and the threats that are fast emerging.
Yeah. And you mentioned technology is changing how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves. It also is changing what is possible, like what the world might look like. And I'm really aware in the financial services space that AI is really changing the game. It's moving us to a new equilibrium. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective, like what's changing most right now in how synthetic media and deepfakes are affecting trust in digital financial systems, or perhaps how AI is affecting trust generally and how that translates into financial systems.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, AI has had a pretty huge impact on financial systems and financial services already. And a lot of that has been based on opportunity, right? So this is looking at how banks and large financial institutions work internally, and how they fundamentally provide Oracle-based figures for knowledge identification, but also for creation of content reports, analytics, and so on. So this is something that banks are really excited about in terms of the possibilities of AI-generated content and generative systems. At the same time, it's also one of the industries that is really on the front line when it comes to taking the shocks of the malicious and harmful applications of AI-generated content, also, referred to most commonly as deepfakes. And I think the question of trust is an interesting one, particularly given where we are right now at the end of March 2026, right? Which is an environment where we have wars raging in the world, where people are now doubting whether all kinds of media that they see about different events in the world are real. And this is what has now happened because of the injection of this huge volume of AI-generated content which is incredibly realistic and easy to create, is that people now just doubt everything. It is a distrust by default mindset. Whether that's a supposed video of a bombing of, a target in a war zone, or indeed if that's a celebrity supposedly promoting a new product, there is a kind of distrust because everyone now knows what is possible. And that for some time didn't really exist. There was a bit of a lag between people's awareness of just what was possible from AI generated content compared to what was actually going on. And this was one of the places where the financial sectors really were actually the first to kind of raise that flag and say, look, we are seeing fraud being committed using voice cloning, using face swapping, to bypass liveness detection for biometrics. We're seeing people use this to create incredibly hyper-personalized phishing links for emails that sound really super accurately like a person actually sounds, using LLMs, right? So banking really has been on the front lines, and it's one of the spaces where we're seeing the most damage being done financially to organizations. And critically, it's not just CEOs and celebrities as it used to be being targeted. It's now everyday people having their voices cloned, having their identities stolen, and being targeted by this content. So it's a really challenging landscape when it comes to the threat perspective of how AI is impacting the financial services. And it's one where there are organizations fighting back, but it's a tough dynamic. It's a tough cat and mouse game or arms race where at the moment, I think the financial services and the people supporting them are a bit on the back foot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of one specific example that I heard of this, like, AI deepfakes leading to a lack of trust. 5 years ago, I don't know if you remember this, but there were these loan sharks in India that moved into the digital space. So they like created an app in the app store, and people would go and download their app and get real money, like get a loan from these loan sharks, but they would be charged exorbitant interest rates. And the app would ask for access to the user's contact information and their photos and a host of other things they asked for access to. And then they took the photos and like did a face swap with the person's selfie. Like, so if it was a woman, like her selfie that she took of herself, and then a pornographic image, and then would say to the person, if you don't pay back your loan, we're going to send this image to all of your contacts. Now, the reason it was reported in the media was because it triggered a huge number, and I don't have the actual number, but I remember it being a large number of suicides. It was really sad that this happened. And it wasn't regulated financial services, but you can see how it would affect trust in financial services institutions. Women are much less likely than men to have access to financial services. And so when we look at the next few years, we're going to see a huge number of women accessing the financial services system for the first time. And so I just wonder, like, what this means, like what AI means for people entering the financial system for the first time. How should institutions respond before trust is lost?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and it's a really important one. And I think it's worth at this point, Sonia, maybe just taking a little step back for the audience to give them a sense of, how this space really came about. I mean, the term deepfake was coined in late 2017 in a way that originally it exclusively referred to non-consensually swapping female celebrities' faces into sexually explicit content. That is all it meant. That is the origin of the phenomenon, right? Is in this highly gendered, weaponized context. Deepfake image abuse, sometimes referred to as deepfake non-consensual pornography, still to this day is almost certainly the harm caused by AI that has the highest number of individual victims. Something my research over the years has tracked, whether that's from face swapping, as you mentioned, but it also can be the scourge of nudification apps, which are affecting women and critically girls in schools around the world. Again, something my research, sadly, from 2019 to 2020 highlighted. This is a highly gendered harm when we're talking about AI risk in this regard. And we are starting to see the knock-on effect of this in terms of how women are and girls are feeling they can essentially appear online because they are worried about what happens if they have some presence, if their images are online, videos, essentially training data for criminals, to steal and then to weaponize against them, typically in sexually explicit content. It does happen against men. It's important to say it's not just women, but the vast majority is affecting women. And I think the example you just gave is a really powerful one, of kind of like a cautionary tale about data privacy and understanding what it is you're actually allowing these apps to access. It makes me think of one of the kind of early viral AI apps called Lensa, which allowed you to generate these kind of stylized AI profile pictures. But in doing so, you actually were just feeding this app the entirety of the information that was unclear how they were going to use it, how they were going to use it to train their new models and so on. And indeed, this shocking case out of India, which I do remember, was another kind of cautionary tale as to how apps in terms of use, in terms of services, can actually really meaningfully impact your safety and your privacy. But my big concern is that in general, this wave of AI abuse against women, yes, banking and financial services and these kind of areas are going to be an area where I think women are going to be concerned and worried about basically doing biometric tests or providing intimate parts of their identity as kind of safeguards against people hijacking their accounts if they don't trust where it's going. But I think it's a bigger problem. I think it's a problem of trust in general, of being online, being a woman online, and what that means in terms of possible risk. I get asked all the time when I go and do keynote speaking and do talks and sometimes go into schools by people, my daughter's friend has been targeted, my sister has been targeted, women, all different women in people's lives being targeted. And I get asked, what can they do to protect themselves? And it's a really difficult question to answer because the amount of training data you now need to create an explicit deepfake or to create voice audio of someone saying something defamatory or embarrassing, humiliating, we're talking seconds of voice audio. We're talking one image, if not a handful, right? And so it is not fair or reasonable to say to women, well, look, you've got to basically digitally cover up and exist, anonymously online, or at least without a face, because there's this risk. At the same time, it is true that bad actors can target you with that little data. So we're in a real bind right now, and women really are bearing the brunt of this as a harm.
And now a word from our sponsor. EY applauds Women's World Banking's 45-year legacy empowering women through financial inclusion. Together, we have a common vision to build a better financial services industry, one that is stronger, fairer, and more sustainable. Find out more on ey.com. One thing we're really tracking is women entrepreneurs. Like 25% of women in emerging markets identify as entrepreneurs. And today, you can't be an entrepreneur without transacting online. Like, you have to have an e-commerce storefront. You have to be able to engage with your customers online. At the same time, the Cherie Blair Foundation found, I think it was last year, that 59% of women have experienced some kind of harassment online, and it's affecting their online activity. Like, as you said, they want to remain anonymous. There are many countries where, you can have an online business, but then when the actual transaction happens, it's in person, in cash. So the online portion is like marketing and selling and engaging with customers. And then they actually go to a customer's house and deliver a good and get cash. And women are engaging their male relatives to do this because the online part is giving them warnings about the world. And so I think your point is so interesting. I've been asking you questions about how AI relates to financial services. You just told me, no, it's changing culture in general. It's changing women's ability to interact with the world. And that affects women's economic participation broadly, not just financial services. Do you want to say a little more about that?
Absolutely. I think you put it brilliantly. I think it really is a kind of a crisis of faith in in the ways that we now do interact with the world. And indeed, a lot of that is digital. In fact, for some people, most of it is digital, particularly when it comes to professional services or doing work, right? A lot of it does happen online. And this is the thing, is that the people that are being targeted by this, there is no type of woman or type of girl, right, that is being profiled here. It is all different kinds of women and girls from all different countries around the world, all different walks of life, who are experiencing this. And we really have seen an explosion of this in the last 18 months. We had an epidemic of it in South Korea, for example. There's a big case going on right now in Germany where a famous celebrity was targeted, which has led to a huge kind of conversation about how we regulate for these tools. The EU, for example, has just banned nudification apps because of the huge scandal we saw at the beginning of 2026 with Elon Musk's AI tool Grok synthetically stripping images of women without their consent on X, what used to be Twitter. And I think one thing to note is that, in some countries, there is no context where this is okay, to be clear. And without consent, this, in my view, is a form of digital sexual violence. But in certain countries, there is even higher risk to women, particularly those where, aspects of, female empowerment maybe are slightly lesser than in some other countries where women's sexuality is seen as highly taboo, and family honor and other concepts are wrapped up in how a woman appears in the world. And so, in some of these cases, there have been cases, for example, in Afghanistan, I believe, where this is not just highly embarrassing, humiliating, and something that is devastating for a career, but it's potentially endangering the life of the person who's being targeted as well. So I think that possibility now that any woman can be targeted in this way, and again, any man can be too, and there are incidences of this affecting men, particularly again in countries where homosexuality is criminal or highly taboo, where they get targeted. But again, vast majority is targeting women. I think it's really critical to think about this as a kind of as a risk that all women now face, simply interacting online in a way that we just take for granted as the bare minimum. Having a profile picture, maybe using social media as a young person, putting out a promotional video for your business, right? If you're promoting a local service or something like this, as I'm sure many women in kind of some of these entrepreneurial contexts do, that is now a threat. And, that is completely unreasonable to say to people, you can't do that anymore. But then we also can't say that you're not at risk. And that's a really difficult position to be in terms of how we get out of it, or how we at least make it better.
One group of our listeners is financial services providers, and they're using AI in big ways. They're really excited about the ways that AI can help them to give loans out to people who might otherwise be thin file customers, to give business advice, to customize their products. And one thing that we are really aware of at Women's World Banking is that there's just less data in the world on women. Women are likely to have a smaller data footprint than are men because they're not interacting online as frequently. They're less likely to have access to the internet. So I just wonder about this trend of women's kind of lack of online activity compared to men, compounded by how women are portrayed online. And I wonder about what that is going to result in as new models get created, as new training data sets get used for those new models. Like, what should we be worried about looking to the future in terms of AI's depiction of use of gendered data to make decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm glad that you raised that. There is excitement about these tools, as kind of we mentioned at the beginning. I think it's really important for the audience to understand that it is okay and it is allowed to be mutually excited and concerned about different aspects of the technology, right? And sometimes the narrative is a little bit reductive about how you have to either be a kind of an AI doomer or zoomer, and there's no way that you can kind of see both aspects. And but you're right. I mean, the way that these tools are trained is particularly the language models, but also the image generation models and some of these other tools, is that they have been scraped on most of the written internet, and that will reflect the biases of that corpus of information. And the world is messy, and there is, as you kind of alluded to, the fact that women have a smaller footprint in a lot of these spaces, but also the way that they are represented perhaps in popular media or in other spaces may mean that there are biases within representation in imagery, for example. If you search for, you say, generate me a picture of a doctor, there's probably I'd imagine there's a good chance you're more likely to get a male figure than a female figure.
Mm-hmm.
It's I say it's funny. It's kind of sad at the same time. It's kind of you laugh or cry. But there was also an image that I saw circulating a few months ago, which was like, show me a female investor, speaking of financial services and entrepreneurship, and it just showed a man in a skirt. And so these kinds of issues, yeah. But these kinds of issues are endemic. And in fairness to some of the larger AI companies, look, they do reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? They do processes to try and address some of those biases and make these models more evenly positioned. But I think one thing that people often kind of miss in this space is that these systems have to have a bias. To generate something is to have a bias, because to generate one thing is to not generate another, right? So whenever these systems are in process, there is bias being kind of committed, so to speak. It's just what kind of biases and what awareness within them is there within the system to be able to balance them out with other perspectives and so on. And that's something that I think there needs to be, more work on. I think the danger I fear is that if women aren't well represented within models, is that there might be an instinct to say, well, look, we're going to create our own model, which has, really, really strong representation of women's voices and perspectives. And whilst there may be value in that in the short term, I think we really want to be encouraging all providers of the mainstream models to do a better job, rather than saying, okay, we're going to create a product for women, which almost certainly would have the pink tax attached, I may add, to try and solve for that. But it's a real challenge, and getting the balance right can be kind of hard in terms of, there is only so much data out there. But I think it's something that anyone creating these tools and anyone using these tools needs to be aware of, and I don't want to say sympathetic to, but certainly accounting for in the outputs that are generated.
Yeah.
I think if I may just quickly add, Sonia,
Sure.
I think the flip side of this, though, is that I do think that there is something which is a positive of these tools, which is that I really feel in a lot of context, they can act as a kind of a great leveler, and they can create accessibility to, tools, information, kind of dialogue, even with a kind of a conversational partner that can help empower women and other, marginalized groups in ways that other technologies have not been able to. I mean, at the point of access, these tools are relatively cheap compared to some other transformative technologies that we've seen of recent times. And, for me, that's something to be celebrated, that, there is kind of this this kind of open sourcing, or rather this deep kind of crushing or collapsing of the hierarchy of who can use these tools to get benefit, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's a great equalizer. And that's something that for us to keep in mind. I think I could get really, really sad in this conversation, but you've really turned it to the opportunity side. I do want to, before we close, I want to touch on regulation. You mentioned the EU has banned notification apps, which is a great step. Financial services regulators, supervisors, and policymakers, though, can't just ban the use of data. They can't just, ban the products that are making people more susceptible to fraud or scams. What can financial sector regulators do about this? It feels a little bit hopeless to me.
Yeah, so I think I can hopefully end on a note which is not hopeless. That would be good. Which is to say that I think the financial services regulators are aware of the challenge, and they are feeding into the consultations and into the ammunition, so to speak, which is needed to put pressure on lawmakers to put legislation in place that helps to address a problem. I mean, I think one thing that I need to be really clear about is that unfortunately, this is not something that we can put back in the bottle and kind of eradicate exhaustively, right? And get rid of entirely. I think unfortunately, this is part of the new world we live in. And we can make significant efforts and make significant progress in reducing the amount of victims and making sure critically that perpetrators are adequately punished for committing these harms. But yeah, we're not going to be able to go back to a world before this technology was available. But in the way that I think we are seeing the financial services kind of approach this is looking at, well, okay, if some of these biometrics are being compromised, how can we strengthen them, right? So what are the new measures for evaluating and making sure that some of the means that we might have been relying on previously are more secure? Likewise, when it comes to like the FCA here in the UK, there are now much stricter measures being put on banks to protect users and effectively liabilities for users being caught up in scams and in kinds of fraud. Now that means that these banks are now admittedly kind of worried about being on the hook for a lot of damages that might occur, but that does mean that they are putting in place more safeguards within their apps, more kind of strategic points of friction to try and help people who might be getting targeted recognize that they are. For example, the bank that I use here, Starling Bank in the UK, put out an entire deepfake awareness campaign to try and help raise awareness, and suggested to people something that I actually suggested to the FT in a piece in 2019 for a piece called Cybersecurity 2030. So I was a bit late. But I suggested creating what I called a semantic password, or a memorable phrase with people that you love to, well, people that are important to you, whether that's a boss as well, to try and basically make sure that if someone looks like someone, sounds like someone, but they don't know that information, there's a good chance that they're not actually that person, right? So there are measures being taken. And on the image abuse side, I mean, again, the last couple of years, we have seen massive strides forward in terms of criminalizing deepfake abuse of women, AI intimate image abuse. That is now something that, for example, in the UK is something that puts you on the sex offenders register. It has a custodial sentence attached in some cases. And so these are promising steps, because ultimately to get to a point where this stuff is marginalized and much less common, it needs to be crystal clear to the entirety of society that this is on the same spectrum as physical sexual abuse and should be treated with the same stigma and disdain, and will be met with the same resources from the state to prosecute as the physical abuse. So we are making progress. There's a long way to go, and as I said, I don't think this is something where we can even begin to afford to feel like we're on top of things. But it does start to feel like in this moment in 2026 that there is momentum building for something of a correction, but we need that to be sustained momentum to make sure that predominantly women, but everyone, to the point of everyone now losing trust in media, feels more secure and safe navigating the online world in the age of AI.
Thanks, Henry. I'm so glad you exist in the world. I'm so glad you're doing the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us. From Rolling Stone and FT to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, we're grateful you were here today.
Well, likewise, thank you for having me, and thank you for doing the brilliant work you do to support women in these difficult times.
Well, to our listeners, I hope that you caught a lot of the fantastic nuggets from that conversation that I'm taking forward. But in case you didn't, I know I always like to share my notes with you. First, that deep fakes are a highly gendered harm, and financial services are not immune to this. We talked about a number of examples of what that has looked like. But you can't put this back in the bottle. You can't put AI back in the bottle. It's just part of the world we live in now. And we have a responsibility to take that into account, whether we are financial services providers or policymakers and regulators. I think what we're seeing from consumers, as Henry shared with us, is distrust by default. Financial services providers have kind of a new burden of trust on them. Like they need to earn the trust of their consumers in order to work with them well. Henry also made some like really specific suggestions. For example, strategic points of friction, making sure that we're not just making financial services as easy as possible, that we're making them strategically difficult so that fraudsters can't jump on a platform, so that a consumer can't easily make a bad decision, those kinds of things. And I think that's really important for financial services providers to keep in mind, because that's new. Like, we've been for the last 2 decades saying, how can we make financial services as easy as possible? How can we lower the barriers to entry? And now we should be saying, how can we strategically build in points that keep consumers safe? So I'm so grateful to Henry. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to seeing you next time, and make sure you check out the links if you're on YouTube, the links below for additional resources.